We are in the second week of our Easter message series, When Life Gives You Lemons. As a church, we continue to celebrate Jesus' resurrection throughout April and into May. Easter tends to be a cheery time of the year, as winter yields to spring, and we experience the freshness of the season. Soon, I hope, the smell of cut grass, the sound of kids playing outside, and the sight of flowers blooming. But this Easter feels different. We are living in an uncertain time. We don't know how we're supposed to act. Interestingly, in that way, it's very much like the very first Easter. The apostles didn't wake up on that first Easter morning filled with confidence and hope for the future. Instead, they were filled with fear and doubt. Their world had been rocked by Jesus' death on the cross. Their hopes and dreams for the future were sealed with Jesus in the tomb. So they were very unsettled and anxious, like we can be today. They didn't know what the future held. But that mood changed through the course of that first Easter season. As they discovered the empty tomb and interacted with the risen Jesus, their mood and their perspective on life changed completely. And we read these accounts mainly through Acts. That's the book of the Bible that details the moments of the early church, picking up almost immediately after Jesus' death and resurrection. If you read that book, though, it's hard to believe that the apostles we read about there are the same apostles we read about in the Gospels. They experienced an incredible amount of personal and spiritual growth during an uncertain time. And so while we have just experienced Good Friday and Easter Sunday, and still find ourselves in a confused and at times frightening world, we're exploring how we can squeeze the most out of this time, how God calls us to grow and to experience life change, not despite our difficult circumstances, but because of them and through them. How to make lemonade from the proverbial lemons that are in our lives right now. Last week, we kicked off this series for the season by discussing faith and hope. Now, faith and hope go together. The deeper our faith in Jesus' resurrection, the more hope we will have for the future. Faith is the foundation of hope, and faith is a gift. Now, we've got to be open to receiving that gift, and that faith is pivotal and foundational for the growth that we'll be looking at throughout the course of this series. We all need hope right now, and the firm foundation for that is our faith in Jesus' resurrection. Today, we are looking at a passage from the Gospel of St. John. It's chapter 20, the same chapter that we read last week. And it picks up almost immediately where we left off. We read, "It was evening on the day Jesus rose from the dead, the first day of the week, and the doors of the house where the disciples had met were locked for fear of the Jews. Jesus came and stood among them and said, 'Peace be with you.'" Last week, we read about John and his experience on Easter morning. Later that same night, John and some other followers of Jesus were locked in a room. Much like us, they felt constrained. They couldn't go outside because they feared the Jewish authorities who had arrested Jesus and killed him. Everyone knew they were Jesus' followers, and so they feared that they were next. And it is in the midst of this fear and confusion that Jesus appears to them. He comes to be present to them, and he offers them what all of us need when we're afraid. He says, "Peace." After he said this, he showed him his hands and his side. Then the disciples rejoiced when they saw the Lord. Jesus offers peace and then shows him his hands and his side, the wounds he suffered on the cross. And when he shows them his wounds, they rejoice. They realize that Jesus was not just some ghost or a figment of their imagination, that he was real, and that he came to be with them. Throughout the resurrection testimonies, Jesus does some very ordinary things, like eating and walking and talking, to show that he did really rise from the dead. He knew that the idea of the resurrection was still a tough pill for people to swallow, and he didn't want them to have any doubt anymore. He came back and walked among his disciples to dispel the doubts that they had, to give them peace of mind, and to settle their hearts. We're going to skip ahead a few verses. But Thomas, who was called the twin, one of the 12, was not with them when Jesus came. So Thomas was absent. Rather than stay with the other disciples, he went out on his own. Thomas probably wanted to be alone and sort things out on his own. Consequently, however, Thomas was not there to witness Jesus' first appearance to the disciples as a group. So the other disciples go to Thomas and excitedly tell him the good news that they have seen Jesus. So not only was the tomb empty, but now they've all actually seen him. Now, how does Thomas respond? But he said to them, "Unless I see the mark of the nails in his hands, and put my finger in the mark of the nails, and my hand in his side, I will not believe." He doesn't believe them. Even though it isn't just one person, but a group of people, it's his trusted friends that tell him, he still doesn't believe them. Part of that doubt was likely just his personality. Thomas was naturally a bit of a pessimist, but most of his doubt probably came from the hurt in his heart. We often think of doubt as an intellectual issue, but often doubt flows from our disappointments and our hurts. Doubt is often a lack of hope disguised as a logical gripe. On the day Jesus died, Thomas had his heart broken. Thomas had put all of his hopes and dreams in Jesus. He believed Jesus to be a good man, leading a good cause. But then he saw Jesus lose. He concluded that Jesus was powerless over the evil Romans and the corrupt religious authorities. They had him arrested and taken away. They beat him up and nailed him to the cross, the most brutal form of execution. And everyone knew that Jesus had lost. What was the point of hoping that there might have been a different outcome when the evidence was so strongly stacked in the opposite direction? The report of the resurrection gave reason to hope again. But Thomas had his hopes dashed once, and he wasn't about to get his hopes up again. His refusing to believe was sort of a form of self-protection. He was using his head to protect his heart. It was easier to despair and muscle through than to believe and hope in the resurrection because hope felt too risky. Now, you might be in the same place right now. You've had some hopes dashed in these recent weeks by any number of things. By the canceling of spring sports, by the loss of your job or business, by being unable to complete your final year of high school with your friends together, by seeing a wedding postponed, by having to tell your family that they cannot come and see your newborn baby, not yet, or by a health scare. And so right now, you refuse to believe any goodness is coming your way. You doubt the goodness and the power of God. But tough circumstances like the ones we're facing right now often make us despair of God's goodness and power. The classic argument, if God is all good and all powerful, then he wouldn't allow any suffering. But we're suffering, so God can't be all good and all powerful. Well, it's framed in a logical way, but it really is a heart issue stemming from an emotional trauma or a wound. If God was good, then he would have stopped the virus. If God was good, then he would have not let the season be canceled. If God was good, then he would have intervened. If God was all-powerful, he would have done something to keep me from losing my job or my business. Our doubt can lead to a lack of hope or confidence in God. Thomas thought that if God was all good and all-powerful, then he would not have let Jesus die on the cross. He would not have allowed Thomas to go through the pain of seeing his friend and mentor executed. Thomas was afraid to hope because he doesn't want to be let down again. But still, to Thomas's credit, he doesn't say that he'll never believe. He says he'll only believe if he sees the evidence for himself. And he sets that bar pretty high. He needs to see the nail marks in Jesus' hand and to put his hand in Jesus' side. In his mind, it's an impossible request. After 8 days, his disciples were again in the house, and Thomas was with them. Although the doors were shut, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." So now this would be about a week after Easter Sunday. Once again, the group is inside, huddled and afraid. Eventually, the early disciples became bold witnesses after seeing the resurrection. And we'll come to see that in the weeks to come. But it took some time and the coming of the Holy Spirit to move them out of their fear. And once again, to this group that was utterly afraid, Jesus offers his peace. Then he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here and see my hands. Reach out your hand and put it in my side. Do not doubt, but believe." Jesus comes to Thomas and offers him the evidence that he asked for. In his love and mercy, he does not hold back from Thomas. Jesus invites him to see the wounds, the very proof that he is risen. They bear witness to his victory over death. Despite the beating and the crucifixion, he rose victorious. The wounds bear witness to his great love for us. They're signs not of defeat, but of a great victory. Thomas answered him, "My Lord and my God." See, in meeting the resurrected Jesus, all of Thomas's doubts and heartache melt away. By encountering the wounds of Christ, the wounds of Thomas's own heart heal. He realizes that the crucified and risen Jesus really is the Lord. And Thomas personalizes that in his statement of belief. He says, "My Lord and my God." And the passage concludes like this. Now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written so that you may come to believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that through believing you may have life in his name. So John says that he has written his whole gospel so that others will come to the same belief as Thomas, that Jesus is the Christ, that Jesus is the Son of God. They will come to believe, and then they will come to have a better life. You see, the problem with the argument that if God was all good and all powerful, then he wouldn't have allowed suffering, is that it's just too narrow of a lens. That argument fails to see the whole story. It focuses on one part of life and makes it the whole. Yeah, you know what? In life, we do experience setbacks and sufferings, and our expectations will continue to go unmet, and we will endure countless disappointments. But there's more to the story than those setbacks. It looked like Jesus lost when he went to the cross. The Romans and the Jewish authorities thought that they had won, but they were wrong. 3 days later, Jesus rose from the grave. His suffering and his pain were redeemed. The experience of the cross didn't set Jesus back, but rather it set Jesus up for his most amazing victory yet, the victory of the resurrection. There is a scene in the movie Apollo 13, that movie with Tom Hanks, about a second mission to go to the moon. When it becomes apparent that the lives of the astronauts are in danger and the mission has to be aborted, someone hopelessly calls the whole mission a disaster. Then Ed Harris, who played the head of Mission Control, speaks up and says, "No, sir, I believe this will be our finest hour." Finest hours often come in the wake of sufferings and defeats. This is why it is so important for us to have a hopeful perspective. It was something that Jesus constantly encouraged his disciples to do. He was always pointing ahead to the resurrection, telling them that despite the sufferings to come, an unimaginably greater victory was right around the corner. This is why you can continue to put your hope in God, no matter the setbacks or the defeats or the losses of this time. We can hope in our own resurrection to come, when our own setbacks and wounds will be gloriously redeemed. We can hope because of the resurrection of Jesus, who overcame what to everyone else would have been an insurmountable and final defeat. Friends, where have your hopes been dashed? What disappointments do you face? How have they impacted your faith and your trust in God? Be honest about them. Look them square in the eye and name them for what they are. And if they feel particularly deep or sensitive, then maybe take 15 minutes this week to just journal about them, just write them down. And then bring those disappointments and those wounds to God. He didn't shy away from sharing his wounds with Thomas. So trust him. He can handle you sharing yours. Friends, it is time for a shift in perspective. It is time for us to move out of closed tomb thinking, that of despair and finality, and to take up resurrection thinking, a very hopeful perspective. When we have unwavering hope in Jesus' resurrection, and when we believe that we are connected to him, we're able to make lemonade out of even the very worst of lemons. We are able to see our sufferings and our setbacks in a very larger reality. We're able to see that they will be redeemed. For out of the ashes we will rise.